Hello, my name is James Bridges, and I am one of two lead bakers at Haymarket by Ashbourne Farms in Louisville, Kentucky. Today we are going to make some pizza dough, and the pizza we are making is Roman Pizza al Taglio, which literally translated means by the slice. So this is a large pizza, great for sharing, similar to a Sicilian or maybe even a Detroit style pizza, but there's a little bit of differences in the way that it's made. The flour that we're using for it is an Italian 00 flour, nicely strong at 12.5% protein, really finely milled, so that's going to give us a really fine crumb structure to it. And we are using Polish, which is a yeasted pre-ferment, similar to sourdough starter in texture. In addition to those, we're just going to add some salt and olive oil, and then there's a little bit of wrinkle to how we're going to add the water to the mix, but I'll get to that in just a minute. All right, first we are going to add the water to the mixer. Always add the water first. And then we are going to add the Polish. I've got it in a bowl, which makes it a little bit easier for getting it all out. And finally, we're going to add the flour. Now, I haven't actually added all the water that we're going to use initially. And I'm doing that because I'm using a technique called bassonage, which is a French technique for adding water later after we develop the gluten. The reason for doing this is because it's easier to develop gluten at lower hydration. And because this is a higher hydration dough, it's going to be close to 75%. We want to get that gluten developed first before we add that extra water to it. And then we're just going to start that mix on low speed, speed 1 on the spiral, just to begin to get that flour fully hydrated. Once that flour is fully hydrated, I'm going to turn it up to speed 3. And for the first mix, we're going to do just about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we're going to give it a rest. This style of mixing is known as an improved mix. Results in less mixer downtime, but you get the added benefit of hydrating that flour ahead of time. What that does is it begins to make those gluten bonds. As soon as those gluten proteins are mixed with water, then they begin forming. But it also begins the enzymatic activity. So you have alpha amylase and protease enzymes, which kind of get to work breaking down those polysaccharides into fermentable sugars, and also conditioning the dough by breaking some of those longer gluten chains into shorter, more easier to manage lengths. So now I'm going to turn it up to speed 3. And I'm just going to allow that to continue to mix until all of the flour in the mixer is totally hydrated. We don't want any dry spots, because if those form now, then we'll never get them out of the dough, and you'll end up with lumps in your dough at the end of it. Once it is fully hydrated, we are just going to leave it to rest for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll complete that mix. Another advantage to doing this is it shortens the overall mix time. And by shortening that overall mix time, we are going to reduce the amount of oxidation. Oxidation to the flour destroys the carotenoid pigments, which results in an almost graying of the flour. It goes from a yellowish hue to a gray hue, but it also affects the flavor, the texture, and the keeping qualities of the resulting bread. So less oxidation equals better tasting, better textured, and longer lasting bread. So we want all 3 of those things, so we're going to let it rest for a few minutes before we do that second mix. So I'm just going to scrape down the bowl a little bit here. We've got a little bit of flour that's stuck to the sides, and we want to make sure that all of that gets incorporated. I try to be as precise as possible with my baking, but I also try to be a bit loose in the sense that, you know, every batch of dough that I make is a little bit different from the next. So, you know, I'm in California today, which is an environment that I'm not used to. Maybe the humidity is lower than the humidity in Kentucky, where I'm used to baking. It's possible that although I'm using the same flour, that this batch of it has a little bit lower moisture or a little bit higher moisture. So all of this is to say that, you know, read the dough and pay attention to what the dough is telling you. And if you need to use a little bit more water or a little bit less water, or mix it a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, then make those adjustments. And the more you do it, the more it'll just kind of become second nature, and the dough itself will tell you exactly what it needs. Today, this dough is telling me that it needs just a little bit more water. So I'm gonna grab just a little bit of that, and we're gonna add it to the outside of the bowl just to make sure that we incorporate all the flour into it. And remember, we did hold back some of the water from the original mix, so we are going to possibly reduce the amount of water that we add late, but we may end up adding just a little bit more depending on how well that gluten develops. All right, this is looking well hydrated now, and we're ready to do that rest. So I'm gonna stop this mixer and we'll come back to you in about 15 minutes time. Okay, we are back after about a 15-minute rest on this dough. So I'm gonna finish this mix off. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the salt to it. We do a delayed salt addition because adding salt actually tightens the gluten structure. And initially, we want to keep that dough nice and loose, but by adding the salt at the second stage of the mix, it's gonna help us to develop that strength. I'm gonna turn this up to about a speed 7, which is medium high. Now you'll notice that I haven't added the olive oil to it yet. That's because olive oil actually coats the gluten, and it interrupts the formation of that gluten network. Any fat that you're adding to the dough can also be called shortening, and the reason it's called shortening is because it actually shortens that gluten structure. And we want to keep a larger, more open crumb structure to this. So we're allowing the gluten to begin to develop first, and then we're going to add the oil to soften it and to relax it a little bit more without shortening that gluten structure too much. So we're just going to give it another minute or so. And as I'm looking down into the bowl, I can see that the dough is fully spread, and it's sort of taking up most of the bowl. As that gluten develops a little bit more, it's going to start to tighten up. It does something which I call a pumpkin, where it starts to look like a pumpkin in the mixer. And it's generally going to start to climb that hook and breaker bar a little bit, and start to pull away from the sides. While I'm doing that, I'm just going to check the temperature of the dough. And we're pretty warm today in here. It's about 78 degrees Fahrenheit. And as long as I get this mix done under 80 degrees Fahrenheit or so, then I feel pretty comfortable about that. It's a little bit warmer than I like to be. I like to come out around 75 or 76 degrees Fahrenheit. That will have some effect on the dough rheology itself, which is dough is a viscoelastic, which means that it exhibits properties of both a solid and a liquid. And the warmer a dough is, the more it behaves like a liquid. The cooler a dough is, the more it behaves like a solid. And so by having that slightly warmer dough temperature, it's going to be a little bit softer, a little bit more liquidy. If it gets too warm too fast, then you actually won't be able to develop the gluten. So that's another advantage to adding the water late to it, because we've got a much lower hydration. We're able to develop that gluten more, even though the dough is a little bit warmer today. I'm just going to turn this mixer up just a little bit more. And now I'm going to add the olive oil to it. The smell of that olive oil coming off of it, oh my God, so aromatic. Now there's a test that you can do called a window pane test to check the strength of the gluten as you're developing it, and I'm just going to need to get a little bit of water in my fingers for this so that it doesn't stick to the dough. And this test involves taking the dough and stretching it between your fingers, and you want it to pull translucent without tearing. And you can see that this dough is tearing, and so it's not strong enough yet. So we're going to carry on developing it. If you're using a spiral mixer, there's a sound of, you know when you pop bubble wrap, how you get that little crack pop sound? The more that it mixes, you'll start to hear those little popping, and it's air bubbles that are getting introduced into the dough, and as they start to pop, that's because the gluten is tightening around them, and that lets you know that it's really well developed. For a planetary mixer like that KitchenAid over there, it's the sound of the dough snapping against the side of the bowl. And in fact, when I'm in the bakery and I've got a large mix on in the planetary, I can hear it from the other side of the bakery when it's ready to come out of mix, because the slapping sound that it makes is just absolutely unmistakable. So pay attention to those little nuances, those differences in the way that the dough looks and the way that it sounds. As we get into bulk fermentation later, the way that it smells is a cue for me as to how close we are to the end of bulk fermentation. So there's lots of little cues that over time I pick up on and you'll pick up on too. Just turning that speed up a little bit more. So while we're mixing now, you may be wondering, can you overmix? And the answer is yes, absolutely you can overmix. And you'll generally know it when you've overmixed as well, because what is getting progressively stronger will eventually turn to soup in the mixer. It won't have any strength at all. It'll start to tear apart. As to how to tell when you're about to overmix, really, for me, that comes down to trial and error. And you know, the more that you work with the same dough, you begin to kind of get a feel for about how long you're going to mix it for at about what temperature. And that doesn't change that much. I mean, a little bit here and there, but it's essentially the same thing. Just adding a little bit more water to do another window pane test. And you can see that the dough is definitely stronger than it was. Still not quite there yet though, so we're gonna mix that another couple of minutes. I love geeking out about the science of it. In fact, I run a little group on Facebook called Sourdough Geeks. I often tell people that you don't necessarily have to understand the science, you just have to respect it. What we try to do through Sourdough Geeks is to manage as many variables as possible, to encourage people to weigh all their ingredients, to use thermometers to monitor temperature, because fundamentally fermentation is a product of time plus temperature. With those kind of basic understandings in place, then you can begin to kind of set guidelines for you know, how long should my bulk fermentation be? How much should I develop the dough for? So let's give it another check here. This dough is looking much stronger now. All right, now I'm just going to add the last of the remaining water. I'm not gonna add all of this though, because this mix is on the warmer side and that dough is much softer as a result of it. I don't want to add too much to it, so I'm just going to add a little bit. Okay, and this mix is now done, so I just need to grab a container for bulk fermentation and we'll transfer the dough to it. We are finished with our mix and ready to transfer to a container for bulk fermentation. I'm just going to grab a little bit of the olive oil that we used and pop it down into the container just to help with sticking. I'm just going to use my hand to kind of rub that around a little bit. Also is going to make it a little bit less likely to stick to my hand as I'm transferring it out of the mixing bowl. Now we are just going to let this bulk ferment at warm temperature for about an hour. I'm going to give it one fold, and then we are going to put it into the fridge to retard the dough, do a bulk retard on it. One of the beautiful things about this dough recipe is that it's really, really versatile. You can make it the day of, you can make it the day before, you can make it 2 days before. The longer you cold ferment it for, the more flavor it's going to develop. But if you're going to cold ferment it for more than a day, then it generally needs to go into the fridge a little bit sooner. There's a relatively high amount of the poolish in here, the pre-ferment. 40% is a baker's percentage. That should give us a lot of flavor development in a shorter amount of time. If you want to extend it out multiple days, then you can reduce the amount of poolish that you put into it in order to lengthen that fermentation time just a little bit. So I'm going to cover this, and then in half an hour I'm going to give it a fold, and then we will go ahead and pop it into the fridge for a few hours to develop some flavor before we make it later today. All right, we've waited 30 minutes and it's time to put that first fold on the dough. I'm just gonna get a little bit of water on my hands so that the dough doesn't stick, and then I'm going to perform a coil fold, which is a more gentle fold than a stretch and fold. I'm just gonna grab the dough from the middle underneath, pull up towards me, and then fold it forward again. And then we're just gonna coil it up, stretch it and turn it 90 degrees, and then we're gonna do the same again. Coil, coil. That is it. Another 15 to 20 minutes, we'll pop this in the fridge, and then we'll come back to it later this afternoon. Okay, we've had the pizza dough in the fridge for about 4 or 5 hours doing a bulk retard, and I've just gotten it out to begin shaping it. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a little bit of olive oil to the pan. We've got quite a large pan here, a 20 by 20. And so we've got about 1,400 grams of pizza dough. I also have some semolina flour here that I'm just going to dust onto the dough to help keep it from sticking. So on the top, flip it over, a bit more semolina on top. And All I'm going to do now is I'm going to press from the center and out, flip it, do the same again. Now this dough is still quite tight because it's been in the fridge for a few hours, but as we begin to proof it at room temperature, it's going to soften and loosen, and we're going to be able to stretch it out a couple of more times on the pan. So I'm going to go ahead and add it to the pan, and we are good. We'll let that rest for about 45 minutes, possibly an hour, and then begin to stretch it out even more, and we should be baking in about 2.5 hours. Okay, we've let this pizza dough relax for about 45 minutes, and we're going to do the first stretch on it now. The main thing is to gently work it out. We want to make sure that we don't tear the dough at all. And trying to pull from the center rather than from the edges as we begin to stretch that dough out. That way we maintain a relatively consistent thickness throughout the pizza. And generally I like to do 2 stretches on it, so we'll let it rest for about another 45 minutes or so after this first stretch out for the final stretch before we bake it. I'm trying to make sure that I leave a little bit thicker portion on the outside for the crust, but we want it pretty thin everywhere else. And that's good for now. We'll do a second stretch in about 45 minutes and then the final proof for baking in a little bit. Okay, time for the final stretch out on this pizza dough. Once again, we want to be very gentle with it because we don't want to tear the dough. And we want to keep a crust a little bit thicker on the edge all the way around. All right, and that is it. We'll give that a little bit of final proof time, maybe about 45 minutes or so before we top it with sauce, and we bake the Roman Pizza al Taglio. Okay, so it's finally pizza time. It has arrived and the dough is all ready for topping. I've got a real simple Neapolitan style tomato sauce here. It's just hand crushed tomatoes with a glug of extra virgin olive oil, a pinch of salt, and I've added a little sprinkle of fresh oregano to it to kind of give it a little bit of a nod to New York style pizza. We don't want to go too heavy on the sauce. We want to keep it nice and light and let those fresh flavors really shine through. And now we'll add some mozzarella. This is whole milk, low moisture mozzarella, so it's got a little bit of age on it. All right, and now we've got some Italian speck that we're going to add just sort of gently placed across the top. Lovely bits of fat there that are going to render down and caramelize as we bake it. One more for the pizza and one for the chef. And some Castelvetrano olives, just to add a little bit of salty brininess to it, kind of cut through some of that fat. We call these nocelladas in the United Kingdom and in Italy as well, but popularly known as Castelvetrano here in the States. So now we're going to bake this at 450 degrees for about 15 to 20 minutes. We'll check on it after 15 minutes. And then after we finish baking this, we're gonna finish the pizza with some arugula, fresh arugula tossed in lemon juice, and some freshly grated Parmesan cheese. All right, we'll check back in 15 minutes. Okay, we're at about 20 minutes of bake time, and I think that this pizza is ready to come out of the oven. We're just gonna let this cool for a couple of minutes before we put it onto a board, and then we're going to finish dressing it with lemon juice, arugula, and Parmesan cheese. Time to get this pizza dressed. Just got some lemon juice on the arugula. Get that on there when the pizza's nice and hot, and that arugula will begin to wilt just a little bit, adding a nice peppery vegetal note to the pizza. And then finally, some shaved Parmesan. There we go. Grazie mille.